Opening the door for the queen and king's bishop, this pawn advance immediately fights for the center. Mirroring white's central pawn instantly contests the crucial d4 square, opening diagonals for both queens and bishops. Developing a knight aggressively challenges black's central pawn, aiming for rapid piece activity. Developing the knight to c6 is a standard and sensible response, contesting the center and preparing further piece activity. Instantly challenging black's developing knight with potential pins and early pressure, this Spanish opening initiation sets a strategic duel for central control. Challenging the bishop's influence immediately, this pawn advance questions white's setup and seeks to gain space on the queen side. Preserving the bishop's diagonal allows for continued pressure on the king side, maintaining flexibility. Developing the knight to its most active square challenges white's bishop and prepares for kingside castling, a natural continuation. Safeguarding the monarch opens the door for rapid piece deployment and a central pawn thrust. Solidifying the center and preparing for kingside castling, this offers a good defensive posture against the Spanish. Preparing to challenge the central pawn structure and gain space on the king side, this maneuver also prepares to defend the e4 pawn should black advance. It's a subtle yet important step in building white's positional advantage. Pushing that b-pawn aggressively challenges white's bishop on a4 and gains vital queenside space, potentially setting up a later c5 break for increased central influence. Recapturing that bishop immediately reinforces white's central pawn and prepares for a potential queenside pawn push, maintaining the initiative after black's aggressive pawn advance. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing to contest the center's central squares, black aims to stabilize the position. This pawn push also discreetly opens a diagonal for the bishop on c8, hinting at future piece development, while simultaneously reinforcing the e5 pawn's defense. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure while preparing to advance the d-pawn is a key positional objective, anchoring white's central presence. Instantly securing the monarch amidst the developing queenside pawn thrust solidifies black's kingside defenses, preparing for potential pawn advances or exchanges that might otherwise expose their vulnerable king. Securing the king's sanctuary, white preemptively sidesteps any potential tactical intrusions from black's knight or bishop down the g-file, fostering a more tranquil development in the queenside expansion. Retreating the knight to b8 opens lines for your queenside pawns to advance further, aiming to gain space on that flank and potentially harass white's bishop. This maneuver, while seemingly passive, creates a subtle yet important repositioning, freeing the c6 square for future piece development and preparing a potential queenside pawn storm. It's a move that prioritizes long-term positional goals over immediate confrontation. Unleashing the central pawn aims to shatter black's solidified pawn chain, disrupting their queenside structure and opening critical lines for white's pieces, particularly the king's bishop and queen, while also forcing black to commit to an immediate response that could compromise their piece coordination. Shifting the knight from its previously active post on c6 to d7 aims to free the c-pawn for advancement, potentially challenging white's central pawn chain and opening lines for black's pieces. This maneuver, while appearing passive initially, is a common Ruy-Lopez strategic idea to reorganize forces and prepare for a more dynamic counterplay. A patient centralization of the knight, preparing its redeployment to the queenside or even a central outpost, hinting at a subtle but potent buildup of pressure along the d-file as black consolidates its pawn structure. Unlocking diagonals for the bishop, this maneuver prepares to challenge white's central control by potentially attacking the e4 pawn or offering support for a future c5 advance. Rescuing the bishop from its exposed diagonal and preparing to support the central pawn advance offers white newfound flexibility. Ray8 fortifies the central pawn chain and prepares to activate the rook, potentially targeting the open e-file should white commit to d5. Initiating a subtle regrouping, the knight ventures to f1, aiming to reposition towards the kingside or support a central push, seeking a more active square away from the current pawn structure and potential discovered attacks. Retreating the bishop to f8 is a defensive maneuver, often signaling a desire to solidify the kingside pawn structure and perhaps prepare for a kingside castling, though castling is already complete. It also frees up the e7 square, potentially for the knight on d7 to relocate. This move might be a prelude to a positional squeeze, aiming to build a solid, perhaps even slightly passive, defense while waiting for white's plan to become clearer. Consider how this repositioning affects the control of key diagonals and the potential for future pawn breaks in the center. The knight's relocation to g3 signifies a patient regrouping, aiming to reposition it towards the kingside for potential attacking maneuvers, perhaps supporting a future f4 push or even eyeing h5. This maneuver, *g6*, initiates a familiar plan for black in this Ruy-Lopez variation, aiming to fianchetto the dark-squared bishop and potentially challenge white's central control with bg7. It sacrifices some queenside pawn integrity for a more robust kingside structure and an active bishop, though it also weakens the light squares around the black monarch. White's knight on g3, positioned for king's side attack or reinforcement, now faces a new dark-squared challenge. Black must be mindful of the tempo lost to this pawn push and ensure the dark-squared bishop's development isn't overly passive once in place. Breaking open the queenside to create a passed pawn opportunity might disrupt black's solid structure, but it also potentially weakens white's own queenside pawn chain, inviting counterplay along the file and potentially creating outposts for black's knights. Shattering white's pawn chain with a bold pawn thrust opens critical lines, instantly challenging the spatial advantage white has been diligently building on the queenside and signaling black's intent to seize the initiative. Initiating a pawn break to seize the initiative, white boldly advances the d-pawn, aiming to challenge black's central control and potentially open lines for attack. This move creates immediate spatial tension, forcing black to decide how to react to the encroaching pawn. The consequence of this aggressive advance might be a slight weakening of white's own kingside, but the potential gains in space and attacking chances are considerable. Black must now consider if this push signifies a fundamental shift in the game's character, perhaps ushering in a more tactical battle, or leading to a positional squeeze if black cannot adequately counter. Black solidifies control of the queenside pawn chain with this territorial push, aiming to cramp white's knights and potentially create a blockade. However, it surrenders the important d5 square, which white can now occupy freely, potentially leading to a central bind and reduced mobility for black's pieces if white can exploit it effectively. The bishop repositions, eyeing the pawn chain's weakness and aiming to provoke a decision on the queenside, subtly preparing for potential breakthroughs or exchanges that could alter the pawn structure's dynamic. Challenging the bishop's dominance with this pawn thrust is a double-edged sword. While it forces a decision and aims to gain queenside space, it simultaneously weakens the kingside pawn structure and potentially creates a permanent outpost for white's knights on the light squares. Challenging the advanced pawn structure, this bishop repositions to potentially harass the queenside or support a central push once the pawn chain breaks. The knight's journey to c5 injects a welcome dynamism into black's position, aiming to disrupt white's carefully constructed pawn center and potentially open lines towards the kingside. This advance challenges the central pawn chain directly, creating immediate tactical possibilities by indirectly pressuring the d5 pawn and threatening to exchange white's strong, dark-squared bishop. It's a proactive attempt to gain counterplay where black has been somewhat passive. Unleashing the queen to d2 aims to support a potential central pawn push, perhaps d5, and prepare for active play on the kingside, while also eyeing the queenside weaknesses black has created with their pawn structure. Pushing the h-pawn creates a dynamic pawn chain and potentially opens lines for the black kingside, though it also weakens the pawn structure and might invite counterplay against the 7th rank. Initiating a queenside pawn storm with the rook offers potential for disrupting black's newly established pawn chain, aiming to pry open the file for potential infiltration, though it does concede valuable time and might overextend on the flank if not carefully supported. The knight repositions, abandoning its central outpost and seeking a more supportive role on the queenside, potentially preparing for a more active involvement in the skirmish unfolding on that flank. This maneuver signals a shift in black's immediate tactical objectives, moving away from direct confrontation towards a more fluid positional buildup. Preparing for a queenside expansion, white repositions their queen to a more active square where it can potentially support a pawn push or facilitate a sortie. Shifting the knight to b6 is a strategic repositioning, aiming to redeploy that piece to a more active square on the queen side, potentially reinforcing the c5 pawn or supporting an eventual b5-b4 pawn push to challenge white's queenside space. This maneuver also subtly vacates the d7 square, which might become useful for another piece later. Exploiting the vulnerable queenside pawn structure, this capture immediately opens the file and challenges black's defensive setup, creating immediate tactical possibilities and a crucial spatial advantage for white. Opening the A-file with the pawn capture immediately re-establishes tension on the queen side, challenging white's control and preparing to potentially exploit the newly created open line for black's rooks. Ridding the board of that active rook streamlines piece deployment. Regaining the piece through the bishop's recapture clarifies the queenside structure, immediately opening a diagonal for the black queen and potentially activating the queen's rook on the now partially open file. A bold repositioning of the knight, aiming to activate a previously passive piece and potentially disrupt black's queenside structure with pressure along the g-file or a knight outpost on f7, though it risks leaving the e4 pawn slightly less defended and requires careful coordination with the queen and other pieces to avoid immediate counterplay. Recognizing the looming threat of white's knight advancing to f7, the black queen strategically repositions to defend the weak squares and prepare for potential counterplay on the king side. Consolidating material on the king side, this repositioning prepares for an eventual advance or supports a potential pawn storm by bringing the rook to a more central and active role, away from the busy queenside skirmish. The knight's retreat to d7 signals a strategic repositioning, aiming to reinforce the central pawn structure and prepare for a potential counterthrust on the queen side, all while avoiding the immediate pressure white exerted on the king side with the bishop and knight battery. Unlocking the king's escape route, 26. h4 challenges black's advancing pawn chain and aims to break through on the king side, potentially creating weaknesses around the black monarch. Shifting the queen to a more active diagonal and potentially aiming for the king side creates a dynamic challenge for white's rook on f1 and bishop on g5. Shifting the rook to the open file immediately puts pressure on black's queenside pawn structure, forcing a reaction and potentially creating weaknesses that can be exploited later. Recognizing the imminent pressure on the file, black fortifies the critical diagonal with a timely repositioning of the bishop, bringing it back to a more defensive square where it can participate in guarding the king side and potentially support a later queenside counterplay, while simultaneously reinforcing the d6 pawn. This maneuver, bringing the rook to the active fifth rank, generates immediate pressure and questions black's defensive structure. Instead of passively defending, white actively seeks to exploit the current overextension of black's pieces. The rook's presence on the fifth rank creates potential threats along that line and may serve as a platform for further maneuvers, possibly targeting the queen side or even probing towards the black king. Strategically, this move disrupts black's somewhat passive setup and forces a reevaluation of their defensive plans. Consider how this repositioning of the rook directly challenges black's king's safety and opens up new tactical avenues for white. A bold repositioning, seeking to activate the bishop and contest control of the queenside's central diagonal. A bold gambit is unveiled, sacrificing the knight for a frontal assault on black's kingside, hoping to exploit the recently cleared h-file and disrupt any defensive preparations. Sacrificing the pawn opens a perilous diagonal towards the black king, creating immediate tactical complications that will demand precise calculation and defensive vigilance from black. A decisive exchange. White's queen now exerts immense pressure on black's weakened kingside, directly threatening the exposed monarch. Black seeks to consolidate and possibly reroute the bishop after white's aggressive pawn sacrifice, aiming to connect the rooks and defend against immediate threats to the king. Initiating a decisive king hunt, white forces black's monarch onto a precarious diagonal, shattering the protective pawn shield and opening avenues for immediate assault. Unleashing a fierce royal chase, the Black King voluntarily plunges deeper into enemy territory, abandoning the safety of castling in a desperate attempt to escape the prying eyes of White's queen and knight, a risky gamble indeed. Unleashing a swift queen sortie, White immediately probes the compromised kingside, aiming to exploit the exposed Black monarch and the open H-file created by Black's recent pawn pushes, while simultaneously preparing for potential tactical fireworks. The Black King, now exposed on the G-file after the exchange of pieces, attempts a desperate flight towards the familiar safety of the center, but the recent pawn push has created lingering weaknesses around its former sanctuary. Bolstering the king's sanctuary becomes paramount as the pawn structure around it crumbles. The bishop on D1 now acts as a crucial defender, preparing for potential checks and reinforcing the central squares that might otherwise be exposed. Seeking to re-establish active piece play, Black maneuvers the queen from its defensive post, aiming to challenge the centralized White pieces and perhaps explore attacking opportunities along the open G-file, a clear shift from the earlier positional maneuvering. The king's safety is paramount, and forcing another check exploits the exposed Black monarch, aiming to simplify the position while maintaining the initiative and potentially creating mating threats. A desperate attempt to find respite, the Black King scrambles back to the relative safety of its starting square, a stark indicator of the pressure mounting on its position. Pivoting the bishop to H5 initiates a fascinating positional squeeze, subtly aiming to control the crucial dark squares around Black's king and potentially isolate the G7 bishop from its defensive duties. Retreating the king now to a more sheltered square, seeking a breathing room amidst the storm of White's initiative on the king side. Suddenly, a dramatic material sacrifice rears its head, aiming to shatter Black's king's sanctuary and ignite a fierce assault on the exposed monarch. Desperate, Black seeks to activate the pinned knight, hoping to offer it as a shield against the oncoming royal attack and simultaneously prepare a desperate counterplay by unpinning the queen. White seeks to exploit the momentarily exposed Black king by forcing a perpetual check, but the pawn structure around Black's monarch offers surprising resilience, hinting at a potential tactical stalemate if the Black king finds the correct squares to dance between. Exchanging queens here voluntarily simplifies the position, potentially bringing Black's king into a slightly less precarious situation, though White still retains a significant attacking edge with their active pieces and control of the dark squares. The exposed king now becomes the primary target, as the material deficit becomes too significant to defend against the relentless pawn push. The knight's return to D7 aims to regroup and support the e-pawn, but it leaves the f-pawn exposed, creating a potential weakness for future exploitation. Suddenly, a crucial tactical opportunity emerges from the seemingly quiet position, as White exploits Black's slightly misplaced knight to open up a dangerous line of attack. A crucial attempt to unpin the knight and open up counterplay along the newly freed 8th rank, though it might be a bit late for that. Sacrificing material to rip open a path towards the enemy sovereign is the aggressive intent here, aiming to dismantle the castled sanctuary. This capture, while seemingly recapturing material, opens the floodgates for White's remaining pieces to exploit the weakened king's defense. Instead of consolidating, Black dives deeper into a dangerous central engagement, sacrificing crucial time for a pawn that doesn't fundamentally alter White's dominant control of the dark squares. The consequences of this pawn grab will likely involve a swift repositioning of White's knight to a more menacing outpost, followed by a relentless assault on the exposed royal family. Knight fork on f5, a devastating tactic that forces a major decision for Black and potentially wins material or severely damages Black's king's safety. Embracing the immediate danger, Black must now solidify their monarch's precarious position. The knight's sacrifice has opened lines, and the primary objective is to prevent White's powerful queen and rook from further exploiting this newfound activity. Consider how the pawn structure, now fragmented, might be used defensively or, if an opportunity arises, to counterattack the now exposed king. The focus shifts to survival and regrouping. The knight's relocation to f7 dramatically alters the pawn structure, opening up lines for white's remaining pieces and creating a precarious situation for black's monarch. A daring repositioning, steering the king towards the open files now that the immediate threats have been parried, hinting at a potential breakout or defensive maneuver depending on white's response to this active centralization. Securing the e-pawn's advance, this bishop repositions to eye the critical kingside dark squares. Seeking to solidify its position on the queenside, black repositions the bishop to safeguard the kingside from further pawn advances while preparing to contest the open d-file. Seizing the initiative, white liberates the rook from its pinned position, initiating a decisive attack on the b-file. This maneuver not only aims to eliminate black's formidable passed pawn, but also opens up critical lines for further assault on the now exposed black king. The repositioning creates significant pressure, forcing black into a defensive posture, and potentially leading to a rapid collapse of their position if they cannot effectively neutralize the incoming threats. Sacrificing material to dislodge the opponent's king from its sanctuary is a desperate gamble, hoping to unravel the surrounding defenses through forced exchanges and open lines. Seizing the open d-file instantly, this pawn thrust liberates your rook and aims to exploit black's compromised king position, forcing a tactical engagement that will likely decide the game. The bishop repositioning offers a temporary shield, but the doubled pawns on the c-file now present a stark positional weakness that white can exploit for significant endgame pressure. Reclaiming the open file with the rook reasserts pressure on the d-pawn and prepares to contest the d-file, potentially disrupting black's pawn structure and creating avenues for further penetration. The rook's excursion to g8 aims to activate it on the open g-file, but it seems to be neglecting the vulnerable kingside and the potential for further tactical fireworks from white's bishops. Consolidating the pawns and preparing for potential advances on the kingside, while also creating a more robust defensive structure. Bringing the rook into play along the open file aims to exploit the awkward placement of white's king and pawns, potentially creating threats on the kingside or forcing concessions in white's pawn structure. Securing that central pawn advances the fight to the kingside, aiming to dislodge black's remaining defenders and exploit the open files that have emerged. Sacrificing the bishop on f3 opens up critical diagonals and offers black a surprising pawn push that could destabilize white's now exposed king and create dynamic counterplay, even if it means simplifying the material. Seizing the open file with the rook immediately applies pressure and forces the opponent's king into a precarious position, highlighting the positional advantage gained from controlling the c-file and creating a dangerous mating net. The king, desperately seeking refuge, abandons the d-file's exposed position, hoping the adjacent squares offer some protection, though the pawns are a long way from reinforcing the defense. Capturing the bishop opens up the king's defenses dramatically and forces black to account for the immediate danger. The king's escape route is now brutally exposed, a testament to the earlier tactical skirmishes and the relentless pressure applied to the queenside pawns. Bringing the bishop back into the fray aims to create a decisive battery with the rook, potentially forking the black king and queen or setting up devastating discovered attacks. Embracing the imminent endgame, the monarch steps forward to centralize, seeking active participation and offering potential counterplay amidst the remaining material. The knight hops to a square that simultaneously defends the pawn and prepares to support a central advance, aiming to disrupt black's consolidated structure. The black bishop retreats to g7, a sensible repositioning to avoid immediate threats and maintain a watchful eye on the central pawns, while simultaneously preparing to support a potential g8 maneuver to contest the open file. Unleashing the king to participate in the battle, aiming to exploit the open central files and shepherd the remaining pawns toward promotion. The rook retreats to a safer square, seeking to avoid the immediate threat from white's bishop while maintaining its presence on the f-file, though its overall impact in this central struggle is diminishing as the queens are gone and the pawn structure is heavily fractured. Shifting the rook to the open b-file aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and create potential weaknesses on the queenside. Unleashing the bishop to disrupt the pawn structure and create a surprise attack on white's king is a sharp, tactical response, aiming to exploit the recent pawn captures and potentially open lines for counterplay. Unlocking the king's diagonal escape route to safety is the immediate priority after black's rook maneuver, aiming to consolidate the advantage gained from the recent exchanges. The king's promenade to d7, while seeming to seek safety, actually exposes it further to potential checks from the white bishop on e6, especially if the f-pawn advances. This maneuver feels a bit passive, neglecting the urgent need to develop black's remaining pieces or at least organize a defense against white's increasingly active rook on b4. There's a missed opportunity here to consolidate the position after white's last move, perhaps by reinforcing the central pawn structure or preparing for counterplay. Stepping forward with the pawn on g4 aggressively challenges black's central control and seeks to pry open lines for your remaining pieces, aiming to exploit the exposed nature of the black king in this increasingly open position. Seeking refuge for the king and activating the rook are paramount goals, as white's initiative on the queenside now threatens to overwhelm black's defenses. Initiating a rook retreat to rb8 offers a crucial respite, repositioning the piece to a square where it can both defend the pawn on b5 and prepare to potentially contest the file should black's bishop move from its current defensive post. Unleashing the central pawn opens up attacking avenues and challenges white's piece coordination, creating immediate tension. Harnessing the newly secured open file, this pawn thrust boldly probes for weaknesses and seeks to disrupt black's defensive structure, potentially creating mating threats or opening avenues for the rook. Seeking refuge for the monarch, black steers the bishop to a square that attempts to bolster the king's defenses by controlling crucial diagonals leading towards him. Unlocking the h-file for your rook opens a direct assault on black's weakened kingside. Unleashing the rook to its heart's content, this sortie aims to disrupt white's seemingly secure king position by creating potential mating nets or forcing advantageous exchanges. Asserting control over the newly opened lines, this pawn boldly advances, aiming to restrict the enemy king's escape and potentially create new attacking avenues. The defender rallies, desperately seeking counterplay by forcing the enemy monarch to shift, hoping to disrupt white's increasingly dominant setup. Confronting the immediate check, the king abandons its vulnerable square, stepping into a more defensive posture. Capturing the rook on b2 with the bishop immediately opens up a critical diagonal for the black king, potentially leading to a mating attack if white isn't careful with their king's safety. Reclaiming the central square, this pawn push aims to solidify white's dominant central presence and restrict black's bishop's influence. A desperate attempt to create counterplay by offering the rook, hoping the pawn push will distract white's king's safety. Securing the king's departure point with urgency, the monarch ventures from the corner, eyeing an escape route down the newly available open file. A desperate attempt to create an immediate threat, but it overlooks the imminent danger to the black monarch, leaving it exposed to a swift mating attack now that the white king is safely tucked away. Unleashing a forceful check, the rook on g7 aims to dislodge the black king from its defensive post, potentially opening lines for further attack or forcing a concession. Black's king, having been a passive observer for so long, is now being nudged into the unenviable position of facing white's aggressive rook on g7, creating immediate survival concerns. The knight now leaps into a vital central outpost, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and threaten key squares. Unleashing the pawn creates immediate instability for white's king, a bold gamble to disrupt the planned pawn advance and inject tactical chaos into the endgame. Unleashing a devastating check, white forces a decisive shift in the board's complexion, aiming to dislodge black's king from its precarious refuge and exploit the exposed diagonals. The black king suddenly finds itself in a precarious situation, caught in a mating net with the white knight positioned to deliver a decisive blow. Seizing the initiative, this knight jump forces an exchange and opens a critical diagonal for the queen, aiming to exploit the exposed black monarch. Black's king is now exposed to a devastating discovery after White's last bishop sacrifice, forcing an immediate reshuffle of defending pieces. A final pawn push secures White's queenside advantage, clearing the path for the rook to actively support the endgame's critical pawn thrusts. Finally, the Black king steps out from its passive confinement, seeking to activate itself and potentially join the defensive fray or create counterplay, a necessary endeavor given White's pervasive pawn structure and dominant pieces. The king is steering towards safety, a crucial maneuver in this complex endgame. The Black rook is now actively participating, aiming to contest the open files and pressure White's somewhat exposed king. The king is now exposed to the elements, granting the rook a decisive infiltration route to seize control of the open file. This critical juncture sees Black desperately seeking a safe harbor for his king, attempting to navigate the treacherous open diagonals. The rook's sudden fork on the Black king and knight shatters any hope for passive defense, forcing a dramatic and decisive exchange that simplifies the position and clears a path for the White king's advance. Seizing the final pawn, Black opens a direct avenue for the opposing monarch to participate in the endgame, a common strategic shift when material is depleted. Solidifying the passed pawn's advance, this march is a crucial step towards securing a decisive queenside advantage. The Black king, having just captured the White pawn, is now a target on an exposed diagonal. A desperate attempt to steer the king towards safety, hoping to find a comfortable square and perhaps escape the looming threats. Unleashing the pawn's final stride to promote, transforming the board's landscape and demanding immediate attention from the White king. Securing the advanced pawn with this bishop deployment is a prudent defensive maneuver, solidifying White's queenside structure against further infiltration, and preparing to contest key open files as the endgame rapidly approaches. With the White king now completely exposed after the pawn sacrifice, this move seizes the opportunity to bring the rook into the attack, aiming to exploit the open lines and create mating threats against the vulnerable monarch. Kings repositioning for the final sprint, seeking shelter behind the pawn shield and preparing to support the advancing c-pawn's push to glory. A last-ditch effort to disrupt the advancing king, forcing a difficult decision for White regarding his king's safety versus maintaining the checkmating net. The king's reign is truly precarious, a beacon of vulnerability exposed by Black's relentless pawn march. Focusing the rook's defensive pressure onto the 6th rank allows it to cover critical squares and support any potential pawn advances, a necessary step to consolidate the position. Initiating pawn advancement on the king's side is a bold attempt to create a passed pawn, but it might also overextend the king's defenses by weakening the pawn shield and opening new lines for Black's remaining pieces to penetrate. Attempting to disrupt the passed pawn's relentless march by activating the queen, but White's king seems remarkably safe behind its pawn shield. Securing the bishop on e1 solidifies White's pawn structure and prepares to advance the passed pawn on the queen side, aiming to create a decisive advantage by exploiting the vulnerable Black king. The rook finally finds refuge on the 7th rank, aiming to disrupt the advancing pawn and potentially create counterplay by targeting White's doubled pawns or the weak squares around the king. The king steps into the fray, a bold maneuver designed to exploit the open lines and centralize the monarch for the endgame's final stages. Embracing the rook's influence along the open file offers a chance to disrupt White's pawn majority, though it sacrifices immediate pressure and concedes further central control. The king's journey to the center is paramount now, seeking active participation to support the pawn's advance and secure the remaining material. The king's flight path seems perilous. The rook's repositioning now aims to block any further kingly explorations and potentially support a pawn's advance to the 7th rank. Securing the opponent's rook with the bishop finally clears the d-file, paving the way for the king to approach and actively participate in the endgame by supporting the passed pawn. The rook now makes a bold sortie, seeking out the lone pawn on the b-file as a potential pawn promotion threat, an aggressive maneuver that immediately places pressure on White's queen and king's defensive structure.